Book 10. Pleasure. 1. The right approach to pleasure. The next task, presumably, is to discuss pleasure, for it seems to be especially proper to our animal kind. That is why, when we educate children, we steer them by pleasure and pain. Besides, enjoying and hating the right things seem to be most important for virtue of character, for pleasure and pain extend through the whole of our lives, and are of great importance for virtue and the happy life, since people decide on pleasant things and avoid painful things. And, least of all, then it seems, should these topics be neglected, especially given that they arouse much dispute. For some say pleasure is the good, while others, on the contrary, say it is altogether base. Presumably, some who say it is base say so because they are persuaded that it is so. Others, however, say it because they think it is better for the conduct of our lives to present pleasure as base even if it is not. For they say, the many lean towards pleasure and are slaves to pleasure, and that is why we must lead them in the contrary direction, because that is the way to reach the intermediate condition. Surely, however, this is wrong, for arguments about feelings and actions are less credible than the facts. Hence, any conflict between arguments and perceptible facts arouses contempt for the arguments, and moreover undermines the truth as well as the arguments. For if someone blames pleasure, but then has been seen to seek it on some occasions, the reason for his lapse seems to be that he regards every type of pleasure as something to seek, for the many are not the sort to make distinctions. True arguments, then, would seem to be the most useful, not only for knowledge, but also for the conduct of life, for since they harmonize with the facts, they are credible. That is why they encourage those who comprehend them to live by them. Enough of this, then. Let us now consider what has been said about pleasure. 2. Arguments about pleasure. Eudoxus thought pleasure is the good, because he saw that all animals, both rational and non-rational, seek it, and in everything, he says, what is choice-worthy is good, and what is most choice-worthy is supreme. The fact that all are drawn to the same thing, that is pleasure, indicates in his view that it is best for all, since each kind of animal finds its own good, just as it finds its own nourishment. What is good for all, then, what all aim at is the good. These arguments of his were found credible because of his virtuous character, rather than on their own merits. For since he seemed to be outstandingly temperate, he did not seem to be saying this because he was a friend of pleasure. Rather, it seemed that what he said was how it really was. He thought it was no less evident from consideration of the contrary. For pain in its own right, he said, is something to be avoided for all, so that, similarly, its contrary is choice-worthy for all. Now, what is most choice-worthy is what we choose not because of, or for the sake of anything else, and it is agreed that this is the character of pleasure, since we never ask anyone what his end is in being pleased, because we assume that pleasure is choice-worthy in its own right. Moreover, he argued, when pleasure is added to any other good, to just or temperate action, for instance, it makes that good more choice-worthy, and good is increased by the addition of itself. This last argument, at least, would seem to present pleasure as one good among others, no more a good than any other. For the addition of any other good makes a good more choice-worthy than it is all by itself. Indeed, Plato uses this sort of argument to undermine the claim of pleasure to be the good, for he argues, the pleasant life is more choice-worthy when combined with prudence than it is without it, and if the mixed good is better, pleasure is not the good, since nothing can be added to the good to make it more choice-worthy. Nor clearly could anything else be the good if it is made more choice-worthy by the addition of anything that is good in itself. Then what is the good that meets this condition, and that we share in also? That is what we are looking for. But when some object that what everything aims at is not good, surely there is nothing in what they say. For if things seem good to all, we say they are good. And if someone undermines confidence in these, what he says will hardly inspire more confidence in other things. For if only animals without understanding desired these things, there would be something in the objection. But if prudent animals also desire them, how can there be anything in it? And presumably even in inferior animals there is some natural good, superior to themselves, that seeks their own proper good. The argument against Eudoxus about the contrary would also seem to be incorrect, for they argue that if pain is an evil, it does not follow that pleasure is a good, since evil is also opposed to evil, and both are opposed to the neutral condition, without pleasure or pain. The objector's general point here is right, but what they say in the case mentioned is false. For if both pleasure and pain were evils, we ought also to avoid both, and if both were neutral, we ought to avoid neither, or else avoid both equally. Evidently, however, we avoid pain as an evil, and choose pleasure as a good. Hence this must also be the type of opposition between them. 3. Pleasure is a good, but not the good. Again, if, as the objectors argue, pleasure is not a quality, it does not follow, as they suppose, that it is not a good. For virtuous activities and happiness are not qualities either. They say that the good is definite, whereas pleasure is indefinite, because it admits of more and less. If their judgment rests on the actual condition of being pleased, the same will also hold for justice and the other virtues, where evidently we are said to have a certain character, more and less, and to act more and less in accord with the virtues. For we may be more and less just or brave, and may do just or temperate actions more and less. If, on the other hand, their judgment rests on the variety of pleasures, then surely they fail to state the reason why pleasures admit of more and less, namely that some are unmixed with pain and others are mixed. Moreover, just as health admits of more and less, though it is definite, why should pleasure not be the same? For not every healthy person has the same proportion of bodily elements, nor does the same person always have the same, but it may be relaxed and still remain, up to a certain limit, and may differ in more and less. The same is quite possible, then, for pleasure also. They hold that what is good is complete, whereas processes and becomings are incomplete, and they try to show that pleasure is a process and a becoming. It would seem, however, that they are wrong, and pleasure is not even a process. For quickness or slowness seems to be proper to every process, if not in itself, as for instance with the universe, then in relation to something else. But neither of these is true of pleasure. For though certainly it is possible to become pleased quickly, as it is possible to become angry quickly, it is not possible to be pleased quickly, even in relation to something else, whereas this is possible for walking and growing and all such things, that is, for processes. It is possible, then, to pass quickly or slowly into pleasure, but not possible to be quickly or slowly in the corresponding activity, that is, to be pleased quickly or slowly. And how could pleasure be a becoming? For one random thing, it seems, does not come to be from any other. What something comes to be from is what it is dissolved into. Hence, whatever pleasure is the becoming of, pain should be the perishing of it. They do indeed say that pain is the emptying of the natural condition, and hence the perishing, and that pleasure is its refilling, and hence the becoming. Emptying and filling happen to the body. If, then, pleasure is the refilling of something natural, what has the refilling will also have the pleasure. Hence it will be the body that has pleasure. This does not seem to be true, however. The refilling, then, is not pleasure, though someone might be pleased while a refilling is going on, and pained when he is becoming empty. This belief that pleasure is refilling seems to have arisen from pains and pleasures in connection with food. For first we are empty and suffer pain, and then we take pleasure in the refilling. The same is not true, however, of all pleasures. For pleasures in mathematics and among pleasures in perception, those through the sense of smell and many sounds, sights, memories, and expectations as well, all arise without previous pain. In that case, what will they be comings to be of. For since no emptiness of anything has come to be, there is nothing whose refilling might come to be. To those who cite the disgraceful pleasures to show that pleasure is not a good, we might reply that these sources of disgraceful pleasures are not pleasant. For if things are healthy or sweet or bitter to sick people, we should not suppose that they are also healthy or sweet or bitter except to them, or that things appearing white to people with eye disease are white except to them. Similarly, if things are pleasant to people in bad condition, we should not suppose that they are also pleasant except to these people. Or else we might say that pleasures are choice-worthy, but not if they come from these sources, just as wealth is, but not if you have to betray someone to get it, and just as health is, but not if it requires you to eat anything and everything. Or perhaps pleasures differ in species, for those from fine sources are different from those from shameful sources, and we cannot have the just person's pleasure without being just, any more than we can have the musician's pleasure without being musicians, and similarly in the other cases. Now the difference between a friend and a flatterer seems to indicate that pleasure is not good, or else that pleasures differ in species, for in dealings with us the friend seems to aim at the good, but the flatterer at pleasure. And the flatterer is reproached, whereas the friend is praised, on the assumption that in their dealings they have different aims. And no one would choose to live with a child's level of thought for his whole life, taking the greatest pleasure in the things that please children, or choose to enjoy himself while doing some utterly shameful action, even if he would never suffer pain for it. Moreover, there are many things that we would be eager for, even if they brought along no pleasure. For instance, seeing, remembering, knowing, having the virtues. Even if pleasures necessarily follow on them, that does not matter, for we would choose them even if no pleasure came about from them. It would seem to be clear, then, that pleasure is not the good, that not every pleasure is choice-worthy, and that some are choice-worthy in themselves, differing in species or in their sources from those that are not. Let this suffice then for the discussion of the things said about pleasure and pain. 4. Pleasure is an activity. What then, or what kind of thing is pleasure? This will become clearer if we take it up again from the beginning. For seeing seems to be complete at any time, since it has no need for anything else to complete its form by coming to be at a later time. And pleasure is also like this, since it is some sort of whole, and no pleasure is to be found at any time that will have its form completed by coming to be for a longer time. That is why pleasure is not a process either, for every process, such as constructing a building, takes time, and aims at some end, and is complete when it produces the product it seeks, or, in other words, is complete in this whole time that it takes. Moreover, each process is incomplete during the process that are its parts, that is, during the time it goes on, and it consists of processes that are different in form from the whole process and from one another. For laying stones together and fluting a column are different processes, and both are different from the whole production of the temple. For the production of the temple is a complete production, since it needs nothing further when it is finished to achieve the proposed goal. But the production of the foundation, or the triglyph, is an incomplete production, since when it is finished, it is the production of a part. Hence processes that are parts of larger processes differ in form, and we cannot find a process complete in form at any time, while it is going on, but only, if at all, in the whole time that it takes. The same is true of walking and the other processes, for if locomotion is a process from one place to another, it includes locomotions differing in form, flying, walking, jumping, and so on. And besides these differences, there are differences in walking itself, for the place from which and the place to which are not the same in the whole race course, as they are in a part of it, or the same in one part as in another. Nor is traversing one line the same as traversing another, since what we pass over is not just a line, but a line in a particular place. And this line and that line are in different places. Now we have discussed process exactly elsewhere, but at any rate, a process, it would seem, is not complete at every time, and the many constituent processes are incomplete and differ in form, since the place from which and the place to which make the form of a process, and different processes begin and end in different places. The form of pleasure, by contrast, is complete at any time. Clearly, then, it is different from a process, and is something whole and complete. This also seems true because a process must take time, but being pleased need not, for what is present in an instant is a whole. This also makes it clear that it is wrong to say that pleasure is a process or a becoming, for this is not said of everything, but only of what is divisible and not a whole. For seeing, or a point, or a unit has no coming to be, and none of these is either a process or a becoming. Nor, then, is this said of pleasure, for it is a whole. Every perceptual capacity is active in relation to its perceptible object, and completely active when it is in good condition in relation to the fineness of its perceptible objects, for this above all seems to be the character of complete activity, whether it is ascribed to the capacity or to the subject that has it. Hence, for each capacity, the best activity is the activity of the subject in the best condition in relation to the best object of the capacity. This activity will be the most complete and the pleasantest, for every perceptual capacity and every sort of thought and study has its pleasure. The pleasantest activity is the most complete, and the most complete is the activity of the subject in good condition in relation to the most excellent object of the capacity. Pleasure completes the activity, but the way in which pleasure completes the activity is not the way in which the perceptible object and the perceptual capacity complete it when they are both excellent, just as health and the doctor are not the cause of being healthy in the same way. Clearly, a pleasure arises that corresponds to each perceptual capacity, since we say that sights and sounds are pleasant, and clearly it arises most of all whenever the perceptual capacity is best, and is active in relation to the best sort of object. When this is the condition of the perceptible object and of the perceiving subject, there will always be pleasure, when the producer and the subject to be affected are both present. Pleasure completes the activity, not, however, as the state does, by being present in the activity, but as a sort of supervenient end, like the bloom on youths. Hence, as long as the objects of understanding or perception and the subject that judges or attends are in the right condition, there will be pleasure in the activity. For as long as the subject affected and the productive cause remain similar and in the same relation to each other, the same thing naturally arises. Then how is it that no one is continuously pleased? Is it not because we get tired? For nothing human is capable of continuous activity, and hence no continuous pleasure arises out either, since pleasure is a consequence of the activity. Some things delight us when they are new to us, but later delight us less, for the same reason. For at first our thought is stimulated and intensely active towards them, as our first sense of sight is when we look closely at something, but later the activity becomes lax and careless, so that the pleasure fades also. Why does everyone desire pleasure? We might think it is because everyone also aims at being alive. Living is a type of activity, and each of us is active towards the object he likes most and in the ways he likes most. The musician, for instance, activates his hearing in hearing melodies. The lover of learning activates his thought in thinking about objects of study, and so on for each of the others. Pleasure completes their activities, and hence completes life, which they desire. It is reasonable, then, that they also aim at pleasure, since it completes each person's life for him, and life is choice-worthy. But do we choose life because of pleasure or pleasure because of life? Let us set aside this question for now, since these appear to be combined and to allow no separation, for pleasure never arises without activity, and pleasure completes every activity. 5. Pleasures differ in kind. Hence, pleasures also seem to differ in species. For we suppose that things of different species are completed by different things. That is how it appears, both with natural things and with artifacts. For instance, with animals, trees, a painting, a statue, a house, or an implement. Similarly, activities that differ in species are also completed by things that differ in species. Now, activities of thought differ in species from activities of the capacities for perception, and the latter differ from each other in species. So also then do the pleasures that complete them. That is also how this is also apparent from the fact that each pleasure is proper to the activity that it completes. For the proper pleasure increases the activity, for we judge each thing better and more exactly when our activity involves pleasure. If, for instance, we enjoy doing geometry, we become better geometers and understanding each question better. And similarly, lovers of music, building, and so on improve at their proper function when they enjoy it. Each pleasure increases the activity. What increases it is proper to it. And since the activities are different in species, what is proper to them is also different in species. This is even more apparent from the fact that some activities are impeded by pleasures from other activities. For lovers of flutes, for instance, cannot pay attention to a conversation if they catch the sound of someone playing the flute, because they enjoy flute playing more than their present activity. And so the pleasure proper to flute playing destroys the activity of conversation. The same is true in other cases also. Whenever we are engaged in two activities at once, for the pleasanter activity pushes out the other one, all the more if it is much pleasanter, so that we no longer even engage in the other activity. That is why, if we are enjoying one thing intensely, we do not do another very much. It is when we are only mildly pleased that we do something else. For instance, people who eat nuts in theaters do this most when the contestants are bad. Since the proper pleasure makes an activity more exact, longer, and better, but an alien pleasure damages it. Clearly, the two pleasures differ widely. For an alien pleasure does virtually what a proper pain does, for a proper pain destroys activity. If, for instance, writing or rational calculation has no pleasure and is in fact painful for us, we do not write or calculate, since the activity is painful. Hence the proper pleasures and pains have contrary effects on an activity, and the proper ones are those that arise from the activity in its own right. And as has been said, the effect of alien pleasures is similar to the effect of pain, since they ruin the activity, though not in the same way as pain. Since activities differ in degrees of decency and badness, and some are choice-worthy, some to be avoided, some neither, the same is true of pleasures, for each activity has its own proper pleasure. Hence the pleasure proper to an excellent activity is decent, and the one that is proper to a base activity is vicious. For similarly, appetites for fine things are praiseworthy, and appetites for shameful things are blameworthy. And in fact, the pleasure in an activity is more proper to it than the desire for it, for the desire is distinguished from it in time and in nature, but the pleasure is close to the activity, and so little distinguished from it that disputes arise about whether the activity is the same as the pleasure. Nonetheless, pleasure would seem to be neither thought nor perception, for that would be strange. Rather, it is because pleasure and activity are not separated that to some people they appear the same. Hence, just as activities differ, so do the pleasures. Sight differs from touch in purity, as hearing and smell do from taste. Hence, the pleasures also differ in the same way. So also do the pleasures of thought differ from these pleasures of sense, and both sorts have different kinds within them. Each species of animal seems to have its own proper pleasure, just as it has its own proper function, for the proper pleasure will be the one that corresponds to its activity. This is apparent if we also study each kind, for a horse, a dog, and a human being have different pleasures, and, as Heraclitus says, or Heraclitus, an ass would choose chaff over gold, since asses find food pleasanter than gold. Hence, animals that differ in species also have pleasures that differ in species, and it would be reasonable for animals of the same species to have the same pleasures also. In fact, however, the pleasures differ quite a lot. In human beings, at any rate, for the same things delight some people and cause pain to others. And while some find them painful and hateful, others find them pleasant and lovable. The same is true of sweet things, for the same things do not seem sweet to a feverish and to a feverish and to a healthy person, or hot to an enfeebled and to a vigorous person, and the same is true of other things. But in all such cases, it seems that what is really so is what appears so to the excellent person. If this is right, as it seems to be, and virtue, that is, the good person insofar as he is good, is the measure of each thing, then what appear pleasures to him will also really be pleasures, and what is pleasant will be what he enjoys. And if what he finds objectionable appears pleasant to someone, that is not at all surprising, for human beings suffer many sorts of corruption and damage. It is not pleasant, however, except to these people in these conditions. Clearly then, we should say that the pleasures agreed to be shameful are not pleasures at all, except to corrupted people. But what about those pleasures that seem to be decent? Of these, what sort or what particular pleasure should we take to be the pleasure of a human being? Surely it will be clear from the activities, since the pleasures are consequences of these. Hence the pleasures that complete the activities of the complete and blessedly happy man, whether he has one activity or more than one, will be called the fully human pleasures. The other pleasures will be human in secondary or even in remote ways, corresponding to the character of the activities. Happiness. A further discussion. 6. Conditions for happiness. We have now finished our discussion of the types of virtue, of friendship, and of pleasure. It remains for us to discuss happiness in outline, since we take this to be the end of human aims. Our discussion will be shorter if we first take up again what we said before. We said, then, that happiness is not a state, for if it were, someone might have it and yet be asleep for his whole life, living the life of a plant, or suffer the greatest misfortunes. If we do not approve of this, we count happiness as an activity rather than a state, as was said in the previous discussions. Some activities are necessary and choice-worthy for some other end, while others are choice-worthy in their own right or for their own sake. Clearly, then, we should count happiness as one of those that are choice-worthy in their own right, not as one of those that are choice-worthy for some other end. For happiness lacks nothing, but is self-sufficient. An activity is choice-worthy in its own right, if nothing further apart from it is sought from it. This seems to be the character of actions that are in accord with virtue. For doing fine and excellent actions is choice-worthy for itself, but pleasant amusements also seem to be choice-worthy in their own right, for people choose them not because of other things, for they actually cause more harm than benefit, by causing neglect of our bodies and possessions. Moreover, most of those who are congratulated for their happiness resort to these sorts of pastimes. That is why people who are ready participants in them have a good reputation with tyrants, since they offer themselves as pleasant partners in the tyrant's aims. And these are the sort of people the tyrant requires. And so these amusements seem to have the character of happiness, because because people in supreme power spend their leisure in them. Such people, however, are presumably no evidence. For virtue and understanding, the sources of excellent activities, do not depend on holding supreme power. Further, these powerful people have had no taste of pure and civilized pleasure, and so they resort to bodily pleasures. But that is no reason to think these pleasures are most choice-worthy, since boys also think that the things they honor are best. Hence, just as different things appear honorable to boys and to men, it is reasonable that in the same way, different things appear honorable to base and to decent people. As we have often said, then, what is honorable and pleasant is what is so to the excellent person. To each type of person, the activity that accords with his own proper state is most choiceworthy. Hence, the activity in accord with virtue is most choiceworthy to the excellent person. Happiness, then, is not found in amusement, for it would be strange if the end were amusement, and our lifelong efforts and sufferings aimed at amusing ourselves, for we choose practically everything for some other end, except for happiness, since it is the end. But serious work and toil aimed at amusement appears stupid and excessively childish. Rather, it seems correct to amuse ourselves so that we can do something serious, as Anacharsis or Anacharsis says, for amusement would seem to be relaxation, and it is because we cannot toil continuously that we require relaxation. Relaxation, then, is not the end, for we pursue it to prepare for activity. But the happy life seems to be a life in accord with virtue, which is a life involving serious actions, and not consisting in amusement. Besides, we say that things to be taken seriously are better than funny things that provide amusement, and that in each case the activity of the better part and the better person is more serious and excellent, and the activity of what is better is superior, and thereby has more the character of happiness. Besides, anyone at all, even a slave, no less than the best person, might enjoy bodily pleasures, but no one would allow that a slave shares in happiness, if one does not also allow that the slave shares in the sort of life that is needed for happiness. For happiness is found not in these pastimes, but in the activities in accord with virtue, as we also said previously. 7. Happiness and theoretical study. If happiness is activity in accord with virtue, it is reasonable for it to be in accord with the supreme virtue, which will be the virtue of the best thing. The best is understanding, or whatever else seems to be the natural ruler and leader, and to understand what is fine and divine by being itself either divine or the most divine element in us. Hence, complete happiness will be its activity in accord with the proper virtue. And it has been said that this activity is an activity of study. You hear that, guys? Is an activity of study. This seems to agree with what has been said before, and also with the truth, for this activity is supreme, since understanding is the supreme element in us, and the objects of understanding are the supreme objects of knowledge. Further, it is the most continuous activity, since we are more capable of continuous study than any continuous action. Besides, we think pleasure must be mixed into happiness, and it is agreed that the activity in accord with wisdom is the pleasantest of the activities in accord with virtue. Certainly, philosophy seems to have remarkably pure and firm pleasures, and it is reasonable that those who have knowledge spend their lives more pleasantly than those who seek it. Moreover, the self-sufficiency that is spoken of will be found in study most of all. Admittedly, the wise person, no less than the just person and the other virtuous people, needs the good things that are necessary for life. Once these are adequately supplied, however, the just person still needs other people as partners and recipients of his just actions. And the same is true of the temperate person, the brave person, and each of the others. But the wise person is able, and more able the wiser he is, to study even by himself, though presumably he does it better with colleagues. Even so, he is more self-sufficient than any other virtuous person. Besides, study would seem to be liked because of itself alone, since it has no results beyond having studied. But from the virtues concerned with action we gain, to a greater or lesser extent, something beyond the action itself. Besides, happiness seems to be found in leisure, for we deny ourselves leisure so that we can be at leisure, and fight wars so that we can be at peace. Now, the virtues that are concerned with action have their activity in politics or war, and actions in these areas seem to deny us leisure. This seems completely true for actions in war, since no one chooses to fight a war, and no one prepares for it, for the sake of fighting a war, for someone would have to be a complete murderer if he made his friends his enemies in order to have be battles and killings, but the actions of the politician also deny us leisure. Apart from political activities themselves, those actions seek positions of power and honors, or at any rate they seek happiness for the politician himself and for his fellow citizens, which is something different from political science itself, and clearly is sought on the assumption that it is different. Hence, among actions in accord with the virtues, those in politics and war are preeminently fine and great, but they require trouble, aim at some further end, and are choice-worthy for something other than themselves. But the activity of understanding, it seems, is superior in excellence because it is the activity of study, aims at no end apart from itself, and has its own proper pleasure, which increases the activity. Further, self-sufficiency, leisure, unwearied activity, as far as is possible for a human being, and any other features ascribed to the blessed person, are evidently in accord with this activity. Hence, a human being's complete happiness will be this activity if it receives a complete span of life, since nothing incomplete is proper to happiness. Such a life would be superior to the human level, for someone will live it not insofar as he is a human being, but insofar as he has some divine element in him, and the activity of this divine element is as much superior to the activities in accord with the rest of virtue as his element is superior to the compound. Hence, if understanding is something divine in comparison with a human being, so also will the life in accord with understanding be divine in comparison with human life. We ought not to follow those who exhort us to think human since you are human, or think mortal since you are mortal. Rather, as far as we can, we ought to be pro-immortal, and go to all lengths to live a life in accord with our supreme element. For however much this element may lack in bulk, by much more it surpasses everything in power and value. Moreover, this supreme element seems to be the person. If the controlling and better element is the person, it would be absurd, then, if he were to choose not his own life, but something else's. And what we have said previously will also apply now, for what is proper to each thing's nature is supremely best and pleasantest for it. And hence, for a human being, the life in accord with understanding will be supremely best and pleasantest. If understanding, most of all, is the human being, this life, then, will also be the happiest. Will also be happiest. 8. Theoretical study and the other virtues. But the life in accord with the other kind of virtue, that is, the kind concerned with action, is happiest in a secondary way, because the activities in accord with this virtue are human, for we do just and brave actions, and the other actions in accord with the virtues in relation to one another, by maintaining what is fitting for each person in contracts, services, all types of actions, and also in feelings, and all these appear to be human conditions. Moreover, virtue of character in some aspects seems to arise from the body, and in many aspects seems to be adapted to feelings. Besides, prudence is inseparable from virtue of character, and virtue of character from prudence, for the principles of prudence accord with the virtues of character, and correctness in virtues of character accords with prudence. And since these virtues are also connected to feelings, they are about the compound. Now, the virtues of the compound are human virtues. Hence, the life and the happiness in accord with these virtues are also human. The virtue of understanding, however, is separated from the compound, for this much has been said about it, since an exact account would be too large a task for our present project. Moreover, it seems to need external supplies very little. At any rate, less than virtue of character needs them. For let us grant that they both need necessary goods. and to some extent, for there will be only a very small difference, even though the politician labors more about the body and such like. Still, there will be a large difference in what is needed for the proper activities of each type of virtue. For the generous person will need money for generous actions, and the just person will need it for paying debts. Since wishes are not clear, and some people who are not just pretend to wish to do justice. Similarly, the brave person will need enough power, and the temperate person will need freedom to do intemperate actions if they are to achieve anything that the virtue requires. For how else will they, or any other virtuous people, make their virtue clear? Moreover, it is disputed whether decision or action is more in control of virtue, on the assumption that virtue consists in both. Well, certainly it is clear that the complete good consists in both. But for actions, many external goods are needed, and the greater and the finer the actions, the more numerous are the external goods needed. But someone who is studying needs none of these goods. For that activity at least, indeed for study at least, we might say they are even hindrances. Insofar as he is a human being, however, and hence lives together with a number of other human beings, he chooses to do the actions that accord with virtue. Hence, he will need the sorts of external goods that are needed for the virtues, for living a human life. In another way, also it appears that complete happiness is some activity of study, for we traditionally suppose that the gods more than anyone are blessed and happy, but what sorts of actions ought we to ascribe to them? Just actions? Surely they will appear ridiculous, making contracts, returning deposits, and so on. Brave actions? Do they endure what they find frightening and endure dangers because it is fine? Generous actions? Whom will they give to? And surely it would be strange if they actually had currency or anything like that. And what would their temperate actions be? Surely it is vulgar praise to say that they do not have base appetites. When we go through them, all the things that concern actions appear trivial and unworthy of the gods. Nonetheless, we all traditionally suppose that they are alive, and hence active, since surely not asleep like Endymion. Then, if someone is alive, and action is excluded, and production even more, what is left but study? Hence the gods' activity, being superior in blessedness, will be an activity of study. And so the human activity that is most akin to this activity will, more than any others, have the character of happiness. A sign of this is also the fact that other animals have no share in happiness, being completely deprived of this activity of study, for the whole life of the gods is blessed, and human life is blessed to the extent that it has something resembling this sort of activity. But none of the other animals is happy, because none of them shares in study at all. Hence happiness extends just as far as study extends, and the more someone studies, the happier he is, not coincidentally, but insofar as he studies, since study is valuable in itself, and so happiness will be some kind of study. But we will need external prosperity also, since we are human beings, for our nature is not self-sufficient for study, but we need a healthy body, and need to have food and the other services provided. Still, even though no one can be blessedly happy without external goods, we must not think that to be happy we will need many large goods, for self-sufficiency, discrimination, and action do not depend on excess. But we can do fine actions even if we do not rule earth and sea. For even from moderate resources, we can do the actions that accord with virtue. This is evident to see, since private citizens seem to do decent actions no less than people in power, even more. In fact, it is enough if moderate resources are provided, for the life of someone whose activity accords with virtue will be happy. And Solon presumably described happy people well, when he said they had been moderately supplied with external goods, had done what he regarded as the finest actions, and had lived their lives temperately. For it is possible to have moderate possessions and still to do the right actions. And Anaxagoras, too, would seem to have supposed that the happy person was neither rich nor powerful, since he said he would not be surprised if the happy person appeared a strange, absurd sort of person to the many. For the many judge by externals, since these are all they notice. Hence the beliefs of the wise would seem to accord with our arguments. These considerations too, then, produce some confidence, but the truth in questions about action is judged from what we do and how we live, since these are what control the answers to such questions. Hence we ought to examine what has been said by applying it to what we do now and how we live, and if it harmonizes with what we do, we should accept it. But if it conflicts, we should count it mere words. The person whose activity accords with the person whose activity accords with understanding, and who takes care of understanding, and is in the best condition, would seem to be most loved by gods. For if the gods pay some attention to human affairs, as they seem to, it would be reasonable for them to take pleasures in what is best and most akin to them, namely understanding, and reasonable for them to benefit in return those who most of all like and honor understanding, on the assumption that these people attend to what is beloved by the gods, and act correctly and finely. Clearly, all these things are true of the wise person, more than anyone else. Hence, he is most loved by the gods, and it is likely that this same person will be happiest. Hence, by this argument, also the wise person, more than anyone else, will be happy. From ethics to politics. 9. Moral education. We have now said enough in outlines about these things and about the virtues, and about friendship and pleasure also. Should we, then, think that our decision to study these has achieved its end? On the contrary, the aim of studies about action, as we say, is surely not to study and know about a given thing, but rather to act on our knowledge. Hence, knowing about virtue is not enough, but we must also try to possess and exercise virtue or become good in any other way. Now, if arguments were sufficient by themselves to make people decent, the rewards they would command would justifiably have been many and large, as Theognis says, and these ought to be provided. In fact, however, arguments seem to have enough influence to turn and inspire the civilized ones among the young people, and to make virtue take possession of a well-born character that truly loves what is fine, but they seem unable to turn the many towards being fine and good. For the many naturally obey fear, not shame. They avoid what is base because of the penalties, not because it is disgraceful. For since they live by their feelings, they pursue their proper pleasures and the sources of them, and avoid the opposed pains, and have not even a notion of what is fine, and hence truly pleasant, since they have had no taste of it. What arguments, then, could reform people like these? For it is impossible, or not easy, to alter by argument what has long been absorbed as a result of people's characters. But presumably we should be satisfied to achieve some share in virtue, if we already have what we seem to need to become decent. Now some think it is nature that makes people good, some think it is habit, some that it is teaching. The contribution of nature clearly is not up to us, but results from some divine causes in the truly fortunate ones. Arguments and teaching surely do not prevail in everyone, but the soul of the student needs to have been prepared by habits for enjoying and hating finely, like ground that is to nourish seed. For someone who lives in accord with his feelings would not even listen to an argument turning him away, or comprehend it. If he did listen, and in that state, how could he be persuaded to change? And in general, feelings seem to you to force, not to argument. Hence, we must already in some way have a character suitable for virtue, fond of what is fine, and objecting to what is shameful. It is difficult, however, for someone to be trained correctly for virtue from his youth, if he has not been brought up under correct laws. For the many, especially the young, do not find it pleasant to live in a temperate and resistant way. That is why laws must prescribe their upbringing and practices, for they will not find these things painful when they get used to them. Presumably, however, it is not enough if they get the correct upbringing and attention when they are young. Rather, they must continue the same practices and be habituated to them when they become men. Hence, we need laws concerned with these things also, and in general with all life, for the many yield to compulsion more than to argument, and to sanctions more than to the fine. That is why legislators must, in some people's view, urge people towards virtue and exhort them to aim at the fine, on the assumption that anyone whose good habits have prepared him decently will listen to them, but must impose corrective treatments and penalties on anyone who disobeys or lacks the right nature, and must completely expel an incurable. For the decent person, it is assumed, will attend to reason because his life aims at the fine, whereas the base person, since he desires pleasure, has to receive corrective treatment by pain, like a beast of burden. That is why it is said that the pains imposed must be those most contrary to the pleasures he likes. As we have said, then, someone who is to be good must be finally brought up and habituated, and then must live in decent practices, doing base actions neither willingly nor unwillingly. And this will be true if his life follows some sort of understanding and correct order that prevails on him. Now, a father's instructions lack this power to prevail and compel, and so in general do the instructions of an individual man, unless he is a king or someone like that. Law, however, has the power that compels, and law is reason that proceeds from a sort of prudence and understanding. Besides, people become hostile to an individual human being who opposes their impulses, even if he is correct in opposing them, whereas a law's prescription of what is decent is not burdensome. And yet, it is only in Sparta, or in a few other cities as well, that the legislator seems to have attended to upbringing and practices. In most other cities, they are neglected, and an individual lives as he wishes, laying down the rules for his children and wife, like a cyclops. Cyclops. It is best, then, if the community attends to upbringing and attends correctly. But if the community neglects it, it seems fitting for each individual to promote the virtue of his children and his friends, to be able to do it, or at least decide to do it. From what we have said, however, it seems he will be better able to do it if he acquires legislative science. For, clearly, attention by the community works through laws, and decent attention works through excellent laws, and whether the laws are written or unwritten, for the education of one or many, seems unimportant, as it is in music, gymnastics, and other practices. For just as in a city, the provisions of law and the types of character found in that city have influence, so also in a house hold a father's word and habits have influence, and all the more because of kinship, and because of the benefits he does, for his children are already fond of him and naturally ready to obey. Further, education adapted to an individual is different from a common education for everyone, just as individualized medical treatment is different. For though generally a feverish patient benefits from rest and starvation, presumably some patient does not, nor does the boxing instructor impose the same way of fighting on everyone. Hence it seems that treatment in particular cases is more exactly right when each person gets special treatment, since he then more often gets the suitable treatment. Nevertheless, a doctor, a gymnastic trainer, and everyone else will give the best individual attention if they also know universally what is good for all, or for these sorts, for sciences are said to be, and are, of what is common to many particular cases. Admittedly, someone without scientific knowledge may well attend properly to a single person, if his experience has allowed him to take exact note of what happens in a given case, just as some people seem to be their own best doctors, though unable to help anyone else at all. Nonetheless, presumably it seems that someone who wants to be an expert in a craft and a branch of study should progress to the universal, and come to know that, as far as possible, for that, as we have said, is what the sciences are about. Then, perhaps, also someone who wishes to make people better by his attention, many people or few, should try to acquire legislative science. If laws are a means to make us good, for not just anyone can improve the condition of just anyone, or the person presented to him, but if someone can, it is the person with knowledge, just as in medical science, and the others that require attention and prudence. Next, then, should we examine whence and how someone might acquire legislative science? Just as in other cases, we go to the practitioner, should we go to the politicians, since, as we saw, legislative science seems to be a part of political science? Or does the case of political science differ different from the other science and capacities? For evidently, in the other cases, the same people, such as doctors or painters, who transmit the capacity to others, actively practice it themselves. By contrast, it is the sophists who advertise that they teach politics, but none of them practices it. Instead, those who practice it are the political activists, and they seem to act on some sort of capacity and experience rather than thought. For evidently, they neither write nor speak on such questions, though presumably it would be finer to do this than to compose speeches for the law, courts, or the assembly. Nor have they made politicians out of their own sons or any other friends of theirs. But it would be reasonable for them to do this if they were able, for there is nothing better than the political capacity that they could leave to their cities, and nothing better that they could decide to produce in themselves, or therefore in their closest friends. Nonetheless, experience would seem to contribute quite a lot. Otherwise, people would not have become better politicians by familiarity with politics. That is why those who aim to know about political science would seem to need experience as well. By contrast, those of the sophists who advertise that they teach political science appear to be a long way from teaching, for they are altogether ignorant about the sort of thing political science is and the sorts of things it is about. For if they had known what it is, they would not have taken it to be the same as rhetoric, or something inferior to it, or thought it an easy task to assemble the laws with good reputations and then legislate. For they think they can select the best laws, as though the selection itself did not require comprehension, and as though correct judgment were not the most important thing, as it is in music. They are wrong, for those with experience in each area judge the products correctly and comprehend the ways and means of completing them, and what fits with what, for if we lack experience, we must be satisfied with noticing that the product is well or badly made, as with painting. Now, laws would seem to be the products of political science. How, then, could someone acquire legislative science, or judge which laws are best, from laws alone? For neither do we appear to become experts in medicine by reading textbooks, and yet doctors not only try to describe the recognized treatments, but also distinguish different bodily states, and try to say how each type of patient might be cured and must be treated, and what they say seems to be useful to the experienced, though useless to the ignorant. Similarly, then, collections of laws and political systems might also, presumably, be most useful if we are capable of studying them and of judging what is done finely or in the contrary way, and what sorts of elements fit with what. Those who lack the proper state of experience when they go through these collections will not manage to judge finely, unless they can do it all by themselves without training, though they might come to comprehend them better by going through them, since then our predecessors have left the area of legislation uncharted. It is presumably better to examine it ourselves instead, and indeed to examine political systems in general, and so to complete the philosophy of human affairs as we are able. First, then, let us try to review any sound remarks our predecessors have made on particular topics. Then let us study the collective political systems to see from them what sorts of things preserve and destroy cities, and political systems of different types, and what causes some cities to conduct politics well, and some badly. For when we have studied these questions, we will perhaps grasp better what sort of political system is best, how each political system should be organized so as to be best, and what laws and habits it should employ. Let us discuss this then, having made a start. And that is the end of Book 10 and the Nicomachean Ethics. And that is the end of the book. Now, this book is probably one of the greatest books I've read. And that's all I have to tell you. Have a great day.